What if the biggest secret in Avengers Doomsday has already happened, and we simply haven't seen it yet? Because somewhere between the final battle of Avengers Endgame and the moment an old Steve Rogers quietly handed his shield to Sam Wilson, there may have been an entire chapter of Marvel history that nobody witnessed. A chapter where Steve Rogers wasn't simply an old man living peacefully with Peggy Carter. He may have spent decades in another universe, encountered Dr. Doom, watched an entirely different reality take shape, and somehow found his way back to the exact moment where we thought his story had ended. And if that is true, then the return of a young Steve Rogers in Avengers Doomsday suddenly becomes much more complicated. The obvious explanation would be that this is another Steve variant from another universe. After all, the multiverse has already introduced us to countless versions of familiar characters. But there is one problem with that explanation. The Steve Rogers we are apparently getting back may not be a variant at all. The clues surrounding his identity, including the history of the character, his connection to Mjolnir, and everything we already know about his journey, point towards something much stranger. This could be the original Steve Rogers, the same Steve who received the Super Soldier Serum, defeated the Red Skull, helped form the Avengers, stood against Thanos, traveled through time, returned the Infinity Stones, and then disappeared into the past to live the life he had always wanted. And if that is really him, then the question isn't simply how Steve became young again. The real question is, where has he actually been? To understand that, we have to go back to the one movie that quietly created the rules for everything that comes after it, Avengers Endgame. Because Endgame didn't treat time travel the way most movies do. The Avengers weren't simply going into the past and rewriting their own history. Bruce Banner explains that changing something in the past doesn't magically rewrite the future you came from. Instead, that change creates a new branch, a new timeline, a new reality. That rule becomes extremely important when the Avengers begin collecting the Infinity Stones from different moments in history. The moment they remove those stones, they create branching realities. And when Steve eventually returns them to their original points in time, those branches can theoretically be closed. But there is one thing Steve does that cannot simply be undone. After returning the stones, Steve chooses not to come straight back. He stays in the past. He finds Peggy Carter, sits down beside the woman he lost so many years earlier, and finally gets the life he sacrificed everything to have. That decision changes everything, because Steve isn't supposed to be in that timeline. His presence itself creates another branch, another reality, another universe. And suddenly, that quiet dance with Peggy at the end of Endgame may not have been the ending of Steve Rogers' story at all. It may have been the beginning of the most important chapter Marvel has never shown us. And this is where one of the most fascinating fan theories begins. What if the universe created by Steve staying with Peggy is actually Earth 828? The same universe associated with the Fantastic Four? On the surface, that might sound like an incredibly strange connection, but look at the identity of that world. The aesthetic feels different from Earth 616. There is a strange combination of retro design, old-school architecture, futuristic technology, and an almost idealized vision of what the future could have looked like from the perspective of the past. It feels like a world that evolved differently, and if Steve Rogers really remained there for decades, then that alternate history would have had an enormous amount of time to develop without the events of the main MCU happening exactly the same way. Steve could have lived an entire lifetime with Peggy. He could have had a child. He could have watched that reality grow around him. And most importantly, he could have become part of a world where people and events develop differently from Earth 616. That gives us a completely different way to look at the final scene of Endgame. We always assumed the old Steve sitting on that bench had simply lived his life and somehow returned. But what if those decades were not peaceful at all? What if the story Marvel skipped over was actually the story that connects Steve Rogers directly to the arrival of Dr. Doom? Because there is an enormous gap between the young Steve who disappears into the past and the elderly Steve who appears on that bench. We see the dance with Peggy. Then we eventually see Steve as an old man. But we never see what happened in between. Decades are missing. And that missing period is exactly where this theory becomes interesting. Imagine Steve living his life with Peggy in this alternate universe. At first, everything might seem perfect. He has the one thing he always wanted. He no longer has to fight. He no longer has to sacrifice himself for everyone else. But Steve Rogers has never been someone who can simply ignore danger. If something threatens innocent people, he gets involved. And eventually, that alternate world could introduce him to another extraordinary figure. A man whose intelligence, ambition, and obsession with saving his world would eventually make him one of the most dangerous beings in the multiverse, Victor Von Doom. This creates two possible paths for Doom. The first is that Doom is actually native to this alternate Earth. Steve's presence changes the course of history, and somewhere along that altered path, the person who might otherwise have become that universe's Tony Stark becomes Dr. Doom instead. The second possibility is even bigger. Doom could come from another universe entirely, but Steve's new timeline creates the conditions for an incursion, a collision between realities that should never have touched. And that second possibility completely changes the role Steve plays in the multiverse saga. Because an incursion isn't just another multiverse problem. It means two realities are moving toward destruction because their existence is becoming incompatible. If Doom discovers that his universe is facing that kind of threat, his actions suddenly become easier to understand. He doesn't necessarily have to see himself as the villain. From his perspective, he could be trying to save his people, and if saving his reality requires collecting power from other universes, finding the most powerful beings across existence, and taking whatever resources he believes are necessary, then suddenly characters like Franklin Richards, Scarlet Witch, and Doctor Strange become more than random targets. They become pieces on a multiversal chessboard. Doom isn't simply attacking heroes because he hates them. He could be building something, preparing for something, trying to survive something that is already coming. And somewhere beneath all of it could be the original mistake that started the chain reaction. Steve Rogers choosing to stay with Peggy. That would make Steve's decision in Endgame far more tragic than we originally realized. Steve wasn't trying to break the multiverse. He wasn't trying to create another universe. He simply wanted a life with the woman he loved. After spending decades fighting wars, losing friends, watching people he cared about disappear, and eventually helping defeat Thanos, Steve finally made one selfish decision. He chose Peggy. And yet, in the Marvel Universe, even the most personal decisions can have cosmic consequences. His choice creates another reality. That reality develops independently, and eventually its existence may collide with other realities. The man who once spent his entire life trying to protect people could unknowingly become one of the first links in the chain leading toward a multiversal catastrophe. That irony is exactly what makes the theory so powerful. Steve Rogers may not have caused the coming disaster through some reckless mistake. He may have caused it simply by choosing happiness. But then we reach the question that immediately breaks the entire idea open. If Steve spent all those years in an alternate universe, how did he ever get back to Earth 616? Endgame establishes that time travel requires PIM particles, and those particles were not exactly unlimited. The Avengers were carefully rationing them throughout their mission. Steve was given enough to return the stones, but if he stayed in another timeline for decades, how could he suddenly travel back? More importantly, why didn't he return through the same time machine platform that the Avengers had used? When Hulk explains the mechanics of their system, the expectation is that someone traveling through time would return to the designated point. Yet when Steve appears at the end of Endgame, he isn't standing on the platform. He is already sitting on a bench. That tiny visual detail may have been one of the biggest clues in the entire movie, because maybe Steve didn't return using the Avengers time machine at all. And that brings us to Reed Richards. If there is one character in the Marvel Universe who could potentially solve the problem Steve has, it would be Reed Richards. Reed isn't simply a brilliant scientist. His entire character is built around solving problems that appear impossible. And once the Fantastic Four enter the MCU, Reed's connection to multiversal science becomes even more important. If Earth 828 really is the universe where Steve lived with Peggy, then Reed could eventually become the bridge between Steve's alternate reality and Earth 616. Instead of using the limited PIM particle technology developed by the Avengers, Steve could have access to something far more advanced, Reed's multiverse travel technology. A machine, a vessel, or a system capable of moving between realities, rather than simply moving through time. That would explain why Steve could spend decades in another universe and still return to Earth 616 long after the events of Endgame. And suddenly, that bench makes sense in a completely different way. Steve doesn't necessarily need to return through the Avengers time machine. He only needs to arrive at the correct point in space and time. Reed's technology could allow him to cross the boundary between universes and deliver him directly to the moment where his original story was supposed to end. To everyone watching, it would look like Steve simply appeared on the bench. But behind that scene could be an entire unseen journey through the multiverse. And if Marvel eventually reveals that Reed helped Steve return, then that single moment from Endgame becomes retroactively connected to the Fantastic Four and the entire multiverse storyline. The bench wasn't necessarily hiding a time travel trick. It may have been hiding a universe travel story. There is also something emotionally important about this possibility. Steve doesn't need to return because his alternate life failed. In fact, the opposite could be true. He may return precisely because he successfully lived it. He got his years with Peggy, he built a family, he experienced a life outside the war. But eventually, circumstances could force him to confront the consequences of that universe. Maybe he encounters doom. Maybe he watches the multiverse begin to collapse. Maybe he realizes that the alternate reality he created by staying with Peggy is now connected to a much larger disaster. And eventually, after everything he has seen, Steve has to make another impossible choice. He can remain in the life he built, or he can return to the universe where his story began and help stop the threat that his own decision may have helped set in motion. For a character whose entire identity has been built around sacrifice, that choice would be painfully familiar. And this may be why bringing the original Steve Rogers back is so much more meaningful than simply introducing another variant. A variant would give us another Captain America, but the original Steve gives Marvel something much more valuable: memory. He has already lived through events that the audience hasn't seen. He has already encountered people we may only be meeting for the first time. He could know exactly who Dr. Doom is. He could understand how dangerous Doom can become. He could know what happened to the universe he lived in. He could know what Reed Richards is capable of. And most importantly, he could know something about the future that the Avengers of Earth 616 have never experienced. That means when Steve Rogers walks back into the story, he isn't simply another hero returning for one final battle. He could be the only person in the room who has already seen the beginning of the disaster they are trying to prevent. And that possibility gives Steve a completely different purpose in Avengers Doomsday. Because if he has already lived through one version of this crisis, then the people around him may be discovering the multiversal threat for the first time while Steve is remembering it. He could recognize the signs before anyone else does. He could understand why Doom is collecting certain people. He could know what happens when two universes begin moving toward each other. And there is something even more disturbing about that. Steve may know that defeating Doom isn't necessarily the same thing as stopping the collapse. If he has already watched one universe fall apart, then he would understand that the real enemy isn't just a single man wearing a mask. It is the chain of events that allows the multiverse to reach the point of no return. That would explain why an older, experienced Steve could be so important to the story, even if a younger version of him is physically stronger and more capable of fighting. The young Steve can throw the shield, the old Steve can tell them what happens if they lose. And that distinction could become one of the most emotional elements of the entire movie. Because for once, Steve Rogers would not be the man discovering the future. He would be the man trying to warn everyone else about something he has already survived. But there is another layer to this. If Steve really spent decades on Earth 828, then his relationship with Dr. Doom could be far more personal than we expect. Doom would not simply be another cosmic villain who appears when the multiverse needs a threat. Steve could have known him before he became the Dr. Doom we recognize. He could have watched Victor Von Doom rise from a brilliant but deeply complicated individual, into someone willing to cross every moral boundary to save his reality. And that creates a completely different dynamic between them. Imagine Steve standing across from Doom and realizing that this isn't the first time they've met. Everyone else sees a mysterious masked ruler. Steve sees the man behind the mask. He remembers the decisions Victor made. He remembers the moment when Victor stopped believing that anyone else could save his world. He remembers exactly how far Doom is willing to go. That kind of history cannot be created through a single battle. It has to come from years of experience, which is precisely what Steve may have had in that missing 70-year period. And if Doom is connected to Earth 828, then the Fantastic Four become even more important to Steve's hidden story. Reed Richards may not simply be the scientist who eventually helps Steve travel between universes. He could be someone Steve has known for decades. Someone whose work he witnessed developing over an entire lifetime. Someone who understands the alternate universe better than almost anyone else. Think about how powerful that relationship could become. Steve Rogers is a soldier who understands sacrifice. Reed Richards is a scientist who understands possibility. One has spent his life asking what people are willing to give up to protect the world. The other spends his life asking whether the impossible can be solved with enough intelligence. Put those two characters together in a multiverse crisis, and you suddenly have a very natural bridge between the emotional and scientific sides of the story. Steve understands the human cost, Reed understands the mechanics, and Doom understands what happens when someone decides that the cost doesn't matter anymore. That also gives us a possible explanation for why Reed's multiverse technology could eventually become so important. If Reed is capable of moving Steve from one universe to another, then his technology isn't just a convenient way to bring one character back. It could represent the beginning of a completely new era of multiversal travel. The Avengers originally used technology that was essentially built around time travel. Reed's approach could be fundamentally different. Instead of asking, "When do we want to go?" the technology asks, "Where do we want to go?" That distinction sounds simple, but in a multiverse where every possible reality can exist somewhere, it changes everything. Once characters can intentionally cross from one universe to another, the walls separating these realities become much thinner, and that creates opportunity, but it also creates danger. Because the more easily universes can interact, the greater the chance that those universes eventually interfere with each other. This is where the idea of an incursion becomes especially important. Two universes aren't supposed to occupy the same space in the multiverse without consequences. If their boundaries begin to overlap, one or both realities can be destroyed. So if Steve's decision created a new branch, and that branch eventually developed technology capable of crossing between universes, then the very act of connecting those worlds could become part of the problem. Steve doesn't have to directly cause an incursion. His alternate reality simply has to become connected to another one. And once that happens, the chain reaction can begin. Maybe Doom discovers it first. Maybe Reed discovers it first. Maybe Steve spends decades watching the warning signs become impossible to ignore. But eventually someone has to make a decision about which universe survives. And this makes Doom's obsession with powerful beings much easier to understand. If he is trying to protect his reality from an existential threat, then ordinary resources won't be enough. He would need power on a scale that can actually affect the structure of reality itself. That could be why beings like Scarlet Witch, Doctor Strange, and Franklin Richards become so important. Each of them represents a different kind of extraordinary power. Wanda has demonstrated an ability to manipulate reality itself. Strange has an understanding of the mystical and multiversal forces surrounding reality. Franklin Richards, depending on how Marvel chooses to portray him, could possess abilities on an entirely different level. To Doom, these people aren't simply heroes. They are potential solutions, potential weapons, potential ingredients in whatever plan he is constructing. And that is what makes Doom frightening. He doesn't need to believe that he is evil. He only needs to believe that his goal is more important than the lives standing between him and it. That philosophy also creates a fascinating contrast with Steve Rogers. Steve has always believed that doing the right thing matters even when it is difficult. Doom could believe the opposite. that morality becomes meaningless when the stakes become infinite. If an entire universe is going to die, Doom might argue that sacrificing a few people is acceptable. Steve would never accept that calculation, and suddenly their rivalry becomes philosophical rather than physical. Steve asks, "How many lives are you willing to sacrifice?" Doom asks, "How many lives are you willing to lose because you refuse to sacrifice anyone?" Neither question is easy, and if Steve has already seen the consequences of Doom's choice, he may understand exactly how seductive that logic can become. This could also explain why Steve's return would carry so much emotional weight for the Avengers. The last time Steve Rogers stood among them, he was still the leader they knew. He fought beside Tony, he fought beside Thor, he fought beside Natasha, he helped bring the Avengers back together after the snap. But the Steve who returns now would have lived an entire additional lifetime. He wouldn't just be older in experience, he would have memories none of them share. He could have lost people in another universe, he could have built a family there, he could have watched another version of history unfold. And then, after all of that, he returned to a world where everyone he knew had barely experienced the amount of time he had lived through. That is a strange kind of isolation. Steve could walk into a room full of familiar faces and still feel like the only person there who has actually changed. And there is one person who could make that feeling even more complicated: Sam Wilson. Because when Steve gave Sam the shield at the end of Endgame, he was effectively telling him that the future belonged to someone else. Sam accepted that responsibility. He became Captain America, but if Steve now returns as a younger man, that creates an immediate emotional question. Why come back? Why take the shield again? Why return to a world where someone else has already inherited the legacy you gave away? The answer could be that Steve isn't returning to reclaim Captain America. He is returning because the threat he witnessed is bigger than the legacy itself. He may have no interest in replacing Sam. In fact, he may be the one person who understands that Sam is now Captain America. Steve's role could be something completely different. He isn't there to become the symbol again. He's there because he knows what is coming. And that distinction could finally allow the MCU to bring Steve Rogers back without undoing the ending of Endgame. His story wouldn't be erased. His sacrifice wouldn't be meaningless. His life with Peggy wouldn't suddenly become a mistake. Instead, everything that happened after he left could become part of his legacy. Steve got the life he wanted. He loved Peggy. He grew old. He watched another world change. He encountered the consequences of his choice. And when that life was eventually complete, he returned. Not because he regretted it, but because there was still one final responsibility waiting for him. That makes his return much more powerful than simply saying, "Here's Captain America again." It turns his comeback into the final chapter of a journey that began with a skinny kid from Brooklyn who wanted nothing more than to do the right thing. But then we reach the most interesting possibility of all. What if Steve's return to Earth 616 happens after the events of Avengers Doomsday and Secret Wars rather than before them? What if the version of Steve we see sitting on that bench in Endgame is actually a man who has already experienced everything that the audience is about to watch? That would create a massive circular structure around his story. In Endgame, Steve disappears into the past. He lives an alternate life. He encounters the events that eventually lead toward Doom and the multiversal crisis. He survives whatever happens during Doomsday and Secret Wars, and only after that entire journey does Reed Richards send him back to the exact moment where he is supposed to return the shield to Sam. From the audience's perspective, Steve's story ended on that bench. But from Steve's perspective, the bench may actually be one of the final moments of a story we haven't seen yet. That would also explain why Steve appears so calm when Sam approaches him. Everyone else sees an old man sitting alone. Steve sees the end of a journey. He knows what he has lived through. He knows what he has lost. He knows what the future holds. And when he hands Sam the shield, there is no need for a huge explanation because Steve has already made peace with his choice. The scene becomes even more meaningful if we realize that he isn't simply passing the torch after a long life. He is closing the door on one universe and preparing to return to another. He has already experienced a future that nobody around him knows exists. And now imagine what happens if Marvel reveals this after the fact. Suddenly, the final minutes of Endgame change completely. The dance with Peggy isn't just a happy ending. It's the opening chapter of another timeline. The S.H.I.E.L.D. handoff isn't simply Steve retiring. It's the end of a hidden journey. The bench isn't just a place where he waits for Sam. It's the destination Reed Richards has brought him back to. And the fact that Steve can return looking old becomes evidence that the timeline he lived through actually happened. He didn't spend a few minutes in the past and somehow age himself. He lived an entire lifetime somewhere else. Time passed for him. He experienced decades that we never saw. There is something almost poetic about that idea. Steve Rogers spent the beginning of his life believing that he had missed his chance to live normally. He was frozen in ice and woke up in a future where everyone he knew was gone. He spent years fighting because there was nothing else left for him. Then Endgame finally gave him the chance to go backward and reclaim the life he had lost. But Marvel may be turning that happy ending into something much bigger. Steve didn't just go backward. He stepped sideways into another universe. He lived there. He changed it. And eventually, that universe became connected to the very multiversal conflict that would threaten everything he had once fought to protect. Which means Steve's greatest journey may not be the one we watched in Captain America, the First Avenger, the Avengers, Civil War, Infinity War, or Endgame. It may be the one Marvel deliberately kept off-screen. The years between Steve disappearing into the past and appearing on that bench could contain the missing piece of the entire multiverse saga. It could explain why Dr. Doom knows what he knows. It could explain how Reed Richards becomes involved with Steve. It could explain how the Fantastic Four's universe connects to the larger MCU. It could explain why Steve can return, despite the limitations of Pym particles. And it could explain why the original Steve Rogers, not a random variant, is the man who has to walk back into the story when the multiverse reaches its breaking point. Because if this theory is right, then Steve isn't coming back to change history. He's coming back because he already knows where history leads. And that is the detail that could completely change how we understand Avengers Doomsday. Steve Rogers wouldn't be entering this story as someone who needs to learn what Dr. Doom is capable of. He would be entering it as someone who has already stood across from him. He may have seen the first signs of Doom's plan before anyone on Earth 616 even knew that Victor Von Doom existed. He may have watched an entire universe become trapped inside the consequences of an incursion. And he may have learned something that no database, no sorcerer, and no scientist could ever fully explain. What Doom is willing to sacrifice when he believes the survival of his universe is at stake. That makes Steve uniquely valuable. He isn't the strongest Avenger anymore. He doesn't have the Infinity Stones. He doesn't have the reality-warping power of Wanda or the scientific brilliance of Reed Richards. What he has is experience. And in a story about characters trying to understand a threat that exists across time and space, experience could be the most dangerous weapon of all. It also gives us a fascinating way to look at Steve's relationship with the multiverse itself. For most of his life, Steve Rogers believed the world was relatively simple. There were enemies, there were allies, and there were people who needed to be protected. Even when aliens invaded Earth or Hydra infiltrated governments, the problem was still understandable. You could find the enemy, confront them, and stop them. But by the time Steve reaches the event surrounding Doomsday, those rules no longer apply. There isn't necessarily one battlefield. There isn't necessarily one enemy. There may be countless realities, each with its own version of history, its own heroes, and its own consequences. Steve has already lived through the moment when that idea stopped being theoretical. He knows that one decision can create a world that never existed before. He knows that one universe can become the source of another universe's destruction. And most importantly, he knows that sometimes the person who starts a chain reaction doesn't even realize what they've done. That is why the decision Steve made with Peggy becomes so important. When we first watched Endgame, his choice felt like a reward. After everything Steve had lost, he finally got his happy ending. And emotionally, that still works. But within the rules of the MCU, that decision has consequences. Steve wasn't simply going back to his own past and rewriting it. He was stepping into a reality that would now continue without the interference of the Avengers we followed. Peggy's life would be different. Steve's presence would change things. Their family would grow up in a world where Captain America was no longer a frozen legend waiting to be discovered. And the events that created the Avengers of Earth 616 wouldn't necessarily happen in exactly the same way. That means the universe Steve entered could develop its own heroes, its own villains, and eventually its own version of the future. And that is where the Earth 828 theory becomes so compelling. If this really is the universe associated with the Fantastic Four, then Steve could have been living in a reality that was already fundamentally different from Earth 616. Maybe that's why the world looks more retro and futuristic at the same time. Maybe that's why its technology evolved differently. Maybe that's why the Fantastic Four exist in a world that doesn't simply mirror the history we've watched for more than a decade. Steve's presence could be one of the earliest deviations in that universe. Not necessarily the only one, but one of the most important. He becomes part of the history of a world that was never supposed to exist from the perspective of the original timeline. And if Reed Richards is the person who eventually helps Steve travel back to Earth 616, that relationship becomes even more significant. Reed would understand that Steve's existence in that reality is not just a historical anomaly. He's a living connection between universes. Steve knows Earth 616. Reed knows Earth 828. Together, they represent two sides of the same multiversal equation. And if Doom is trying to control or stabilize that equation, then Reed and Steve become natural obstacles. Reed has the scientific knowledge to challenge Doom's plan. Steve has the personal experience to understand Doom's motives. That's why their alliance could be one of the most important relationships in Doomsday. But there is another possibility hiding underneath all of this. What if Reed's technology isn't simply a way to move Steve between universes? What if Steve's journey actually helps inspire the technology that eventually becomes essential to multiversal travel? This would create a fascinating loop. Steve needs Reed's technology to return to Earth 616. Reed develops or perfects that technology through his understanding of Steve's situation. That same technology eventually becomes connected to the larger multiverse. And once the technology exists, other characters can begin crossing realities with increasing precision. In other words, Steve's return could be part of the reason the barrier between universes becomes easier to cross in the first place. That would make the multiverse feel less like a random collection of disconnected worlds, and more like a system where every choice has consequences. The Avengers use time travel. Branches appear. Steve creates another reality. That reality develops new technology. Reed learns how to cross universes. Doom discovers the consequences. Incursions begin. Powerful beings become targets. And eventually, the entire structure of reality begins to collapse. None of these events has to be isolated. They can all be pieces of the same chain. And if Marvel wants to make the multiverse saga feel like one giant story, rather than a series of unrelated movies, this kind of connection is exactly what could tie everything together. There is also a reason the original Steve Rogers matters more than any variant could. Variants are interesting because they show us possibilities. But the original Steve represents continuity. His entire character arc has always been about consequences. He was a man out of time. He lost his generation. He watched friends grow old while he remained young. He struggled with the idea that the world he belonged to had disappeared. Then he finally found a way to live with that loss. If he returns as the same Steve, every moment carries the weight of everything he has already experienced. When he sees Sam, he doesn't just see the new Captain America. He sees the person he trusted with his legacy. When he sees the Avengers, he doesn't just see teammates. He sees people whose lives he once fought to save. And when he sees Doom, he could see the person who represents the darkest possible answer to the question Steve has spent his entire life asking. How much should one person sacrifice to save everyone else? That is what could make their confrontation so powerful. Doom could tell Steve that he has done the same thing. He has sacrificed worlds. He has sacrificed people. He has sacrificed himself. The difference, Doom might argue, is that Steve's sacrifices were celebrated because they happened to produce the outcome everyone wanted. Doom's sacrifices are condemned because they are harder to accept. And Steve would have to confront that argument without pretending it is completely meaningless, because Steve has made impossible choices too. He chose to return the stones even though it meant losing the chance to remain with his friends. He chose to fight Thanos when the odds were almost impossible. He chose to give up his life in the ice. The difference is that Steve never believed his own survival gave him the right to decide who else should die. Doom could believe exactly the opposite. And that philosophical conflict could become the heart of the story. Not Captain America versus Dr. Doom because one is a hero and the other is a villain, but two men who both believe they are responsible for saving people and who reached completely different conclusions about what that responsibility allows them to do. Steve believes that power creates responsibility. Doom believes that power creates obligation. If Doom has the ability to save his universe, then in his mind he has no choice but to use it, even if other universes pay the price. Steve would argue that saving your own world by destroying someone else's doesn't make you a savior. It makes you the cause of another tragedy. And perhaps that is why Steve has to return. Not because he is the strongest person who can defeat Doom, but because he understands the moral line Doom has crossed. Reed can calculate the mathematics of an incursion. Strange can understand the mystical consequences. Wanda can understand the nature of reality itself. But Steve can look Doom in the eyes and say, "I know what happens when you make that choice." That sentence alone could carry decades of unseen history behind it. Because Steve isn't warning Doom based on a theory. He isn't repeating something he read in a report. He may be speaking from experience. He has already watched Doom make the decision. He has already seen what that decision costs. He may have already watched people he cared about disappear because one man believed his universe mattered more than everyone else's. And if that is what Steve brings back with him from Earth 828, then his greatest contribution to Doomsday isn't a shield, a uniform, or a super soldier serum. It's knowledge. Knowledge of a future that the rest of the Avengers haven't lived yet. And that brings us back to the mystery of the young Steve Rogers. If the Steve who appears in Avengers Doomsday is truly the original Steve, then there has to be an explanation for why he is no longer the elderly man we saw at the end of Endgame. The simplest answer would be another time travel trick. But if Reed Richards is involved, the explanation could be much more interesting. Steve may not have physically reversed his entire life. The multiverse itself could have allowed him to return at a different point in his personal timeline. Or Reed's technology could potentially connect different versions of the same person's temporal existence. Either way, the important point is that the man who returns doesn't have to be a variant to be young again. He can still be Steve Rogers. The same Steve. The same memories. The same history. Just return to the moment when he is needed most. And if Marvel eventually explains that Steve's journey through Earth 828 happened before he returned to the bench, then the entire ending of Endgame becomes a kind of hidden time capsule. The movie gave us the ending without showing us the story that created it. We thought Steve was simply saying goodbye, but perhaps he was actually completing a mission that lasted decades. The reason he was so calm wasn't because he had nothing left to do, it was because he had already done it. That would make his final conversation with Sam even more powerful. Steve gives him the shield because he knows Sam doesn't need another Steve Rogers. He knows the world has changed. He knows that the future cannot simply be rebuilt from the past. And even after everything he has experienced in another universe, Steve still chooses to let someone else carry the symbol. That's the final proof that he hasn't returned to reclaim his old identity. He's returned because the situation requires the man behind the symbol. And there is something beautiful about that. Steve Rogers began his journey wanting to prove that he could fight. He ended it by learning when to let someone else fight. If Doomsday brings him back, then the question is no longer whether Steve Rogers can still be Captain America. The question is whether the man who once saved one world can help save a multiverse without becoming the kind of person he spent his entire life fighting against. Because this time, Steve isn't walking into a war he doesn't understand. He's walking into one he's already survived. And if the theory is correct, the reason Marvel waited so long to show us what happened after Steve disappeared into the past may be because that missing story isn't a side chapter at all. It is the story that explains why Doctor Doom exists, why the Fantastic Four matter, why Reed Richards can cross realities, why incursions become inevitable, and why the original Steve Rogers has one final journey left. The old man on the bench wasn't the end of Steve Rogers. It was the moment he came home. And somewhere between that bench and the return of the young Steve, there may be an entire universe of history waiting to be revealed. If Marvel plays this correctly, Steve's return won't erase Endgame. It will finally explain it.